Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we take the time to really listen to their needs and we understand all the different options that are available across the campus for them.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.
Welcome everyone. My name is Charlie Stein, and I'll be your moderator today. Just briefly about me, I came to the University of Colorado as a freshman sight unseen in 1973. I got off the bus at 16th and Broadway, and immediately a monsoon summer storm came down on my head. I was a little wide-eyed and nervous, and I finally winded my way to Baker Hall, where I spent the first year. So 50-plus years later, I'm back on campus. I'm still a little wide-eyed and nervous, this being my first moderation as a panel here. So here we are. And for the recording purposes today is Wednesday, April 10th, 2024. It's 9 a.m. This panel number is 17997. It's titled The Apocalypse Now, The Real Big Threats to Humanity. So if you thought you were coming for that stand-up comedy panel, you should go out the back now and around to the right. Before we get started, the University of Colorado Boulder, Colorado's flagship university, honors and recognizes the many contributions of indigenous peoples in our state. CU Boulder acknowledges that it is located on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, and many other Native American nations. Their forced removal from these territories has caused devastating and lasting impacts. While the University of Colorado Boulder can never undo or rectify the devastation wrought on Native Americans, we commit to improving and enhancing engagement with indigenous peoples and issues locally and globally. We will do this by recognizing and amplifying the voices of Native American CU Boulder students, staff, and faculty, and their work. Educating, conducting research, supporting student success, and integrating indigenous knowledge. Consulting, engaging, and working collaboratively with tribal nations to enhance our ability to provide access and culturally sensitive support, and to recruit, retain, and graduate Native American students in a climate that is inclusive and respectful. We will encourage questions today, and there's a couple of producers, one over there, Eli, and Bob back there, and they have cards. So at any time during the event, if you have a question, raise your hand, and Eli or Bob will bring you a card with a pencil. And if you could print, that would be preferred, and we'll try to get to your questions. And if you are a student and you have a question, just write student on your card, and we'll try to move that to the front of the line. And now I'd like to do a brief introduction. We have a very esteemed panel. They've all been involved in government. They've all been, you might see them on TV, you might read them in the newspaper, and their full bios are available online. So I'm just going to do a short bio. Joe Cirincione. He's been here before, and I see a lot of people. He's got a fan club. All right. Is known for his years as president of Plowshares Fund, a public grant-making foundation that supports initiatives to prevent the spread and use of nuclear weapons and to prevent conflicts that could lead to their use. Next, we have Sarah Yeager, is a Washington, D.C. director at Human Rights Watch and leads the organization's engagement with the U.S. government on global human rights issues with a particular focus on national security and foreign policy. She also lives with a very big cat.
How did that get in there?
That was it. That was in your bio. Morgan Kay is a University of Colorado graduate, as am I. She's the founder of Motive International, a social enterprise with a mission to mitigate conflict and enhance stability in fragile societies around the world. And at the end is John Spencer, serves as the chair of the Urban Warfare Studies at the Modern War Institute at West Point. John served for more than 25 years in the active Army with 2 combat deployments to Iraq as both an infantry platoon leader and company commander. So we have a diverse and very interesting group. Apocalypse Now, the real big threats to humanity. To give this broad and weighty topic some context, I will be using the term polycrisis to describe the global moment we are in at this time. Perhaps some of you have heard that title as something in the news you're starting to hear a little bit more of. The polycrisis refers to the interconnected and simultaneous occurrence of multiple crises spanning economic, environmental, social, and political domains, challenging traditional worldwide systems and institutions. Here are just a few of the many dozens of crises we are facing. Armed conflicts between countries and within countries. Failure to mitigate and to adapt to climate change. Biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse. Wealth inequality, societal polarization and unrest. Involuntary migration and erosion of human rights. So again, the stand-up comedies around the back. Heavy topics, but important topics to discuss. Each year, the World Economic Forum, which is the folks that put the Davos event on, I've never been invited, but surveys hundreds of experts and puts out a global risk report. The experts are asked what their 10-year global outlook is using a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being the highest risk. A 1 on the low end is expecting renewed stability with a revival of global resilience. On 5, on the high end, is progressive tipping points and persistent crises leading to catastrophic outcomes. So our panels tonight are going to start giving their number on their global outlook for 10 years, using their number on a scale of 1 to 5, and they will give their reasons why. Joe, what's your number?
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. But you have to wait for my number just for a couple of minutes, because I want to give it some context. It's a pleasure to be back here at Boulder at the World Affairs Conference. And this is not my first Apocalypse Now panel. We have been debating this subject for many years here, and I've been on panels where I was advocating that nuclear weapons were our greatest threat, where others were saying no, with super volcanoes, asteroids, robot rebellion, nanotechnology. There's a long list. I regret to tell you that over the years the list has grown. The threats are increasing, not decreasing. So I'm fairly pessimistic. My number is 4, meaning we're going to have constantly volatility across economies and industries with multiple shocks affecting the global order. So I think our 10-year outlook is troubling. And I thank you all for coming to this session, because I know we all have conflicts and challenges that we have to confront in our daily lives with our family, our workplace, our state. But what we're here to talk about is the global threats. the ones that affect all of humanity. And for my money, there's really three that top everything else in the risk to destroying all of what humanity has built over the millennia. And those are global warming, which can destroy humanity over decades, pandemics, which can do it over years, and nuclear weapons, which can do it in hours. All of those threaten our daily existence, and all of those crises are getting worse, and we now have to consider a fourth one, which is artificial intelligence. We're going to have discussions at other panels here about artificial intelligence. I think the parameters of that risk are still unknown, so I'm not ready to put that into my category of top three yet, but it's a contender, you know, and it's there. And these are not insolvable problems. We can correct this. We can prevent global warming. We can contain pandemics. We can get rid of nuclear weapons. These are, after all, our machines and processes that we've invented. We can control them. But what gets in our way is these other crises that beset us, that my other panelists are experts on. The things that are driven by profit motives or power grabs that prevent the kind of global cooperation you need to solve these problems. And so while we have to be conscious that there are things out there that can destroy humanity, that we've set in motion these processes, these machines, these operations that can destroy humanity, we can't fix them, but we're going to have to get through these other crises to do them. Let me just give you one example. Just 2 days ago, there was a drone strike on the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant in Ukraine. It's unclear who launched the drones. I just did a little interview about this yesterday morning. But 3 drones hit part of the Zaporizhzhia power plant. That nuclear power plant is the largest one in Europe. It has 6 different reactors. They're all in various stages of shutdown right now, but one of those drones hit the containment vessel, the containment dome over it. It didn't crack it, nor did the drones knock out the power supply, but if the power supply or the water supply were to be cut off at that plant, you could see a meltdown of the fuel rods that are there, either in the reactors or in the storage ponds, and you would see a nuclear catastrophe on the scale roughly of Fukushima. And you can right there, you can see how the sort of local military conflict, Russia's occupation of Ukraine, can trigger these bigger catastrophes. And of course, it gets even worse than that because over the last 2 years, we've seen Vladimir Putin repeatedly threaten to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. I don't think that's likely, but it's possible. It's there. It's not a zero chance that he will do this. And if he did do that, the crisis then escalates out. So you see that in order to solve these big crises, you have to be paying attention to these, what I would consider smaller, more localized or more regional crises to, for example, end the Ukraine war, to end the war in Gaza. These are the 2 biggest wars right now that are going on. We don't have actually that many wars in the world. I don't know if I'm going to disagree with my panelists on this or not, but global, historically, there are fewer people dying in wars now than almost any period in the last 1,000 years. We're a more peaceful planet. I know this is hard to believe, but just by the numbers, we're a more peaceful planet. But that doesn't mean we're peaceful. And that doesn't mean these wars aren't horrible. And so the longer you let things like Ukraine or Gaza continue, the more risk you have that this could be metastasize into a regional conflict that could then become global, involving some of the weapons like nuclear that I concentrate on that could have immediate global impact. So that's sort of, I hope I've sort of set the stage for the discussion to follow. Thank you.
Sarah?
Hi, the last time I was here was 2014 for this conference, and I'm so delighted to be back. This is so much fun, except for the title that they've chosen for this topic. I have a lot more gray hair, a lot more things have happened. I want to say, so we always think that our time, then what's happening is the worst. This is the worst. It couldn't possibly have been worse than this. There's so many crises. I think if we look back through history, there were probably crises, whatever they're calling it now, for a very long time. I think humans have probably always felt this way. Now we have all of this, we have eyes on everything because of social media and the internet, and so we see all of these terrible things happening. And I will say, as Washington Director of Human Rights Watch, my work is every human rights abuse in the world that has a US nexus, which is like all of them. So every single day I am seeing the absolute worst that people can do to each other, and also the best of what people can be rallied to do about those abuses. So I will say, in terms of the number on this sheet, I don't look at it this way. So I look at it in a deeply personal way, the number of, on a scale of 1 to 5, how we're feeling, how each of us is feeling about the crises going on in the world. And that's going to be different for every single person, because a lot of these human rights abuses are happening in a daily way to individual people and to communities. And so Davos can say, well, look at the trend that's happening. And I say, look at what's happening to that person. So I've worked on armed conflict for about 20 years, a lot with militaries all around the world, Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, a lot with the US military, particularly on counterterrorism. And I was feeling, this is gonna be like, here's my emotional roller coaster, and this is gonna be a therapy session for the next 3.5 minutes. I was feeling pretty good on October 6th because of the ways in which the United States and other militaries, other allied militaries around the world, had taken the lessons of the past 20 years and said, civilian protection, human rights, we're gonna do these things right for the future. And Secretary Austin, who is our Secretary of Defense, made this remarkable effort over the past 2 or so years to really embed those things inside of the Pentagon, which is not a place where it's easy to embed those things necessarily for the future. So I was feeling pretty good. I will not make this panel about Gaza, but here's what I want to say about Gaza, because it affects how my personal journey of this scale and how I look at the next 10 years of what may happen. The human rights and civilian protection norms that we have relied on since World War II, I see crumbling out from underneath us. Welcome to your morning panel. I am mostly morose and depressed about this. I work on it every single day, but have no silver bullet for how to fix it. The United States is supporting Israel while Israel is committing, Human Rights Watch has found, violations of US law and international law on a scale that is pretty remarkable. Now, the US, when I go to meetings at the Pentagon, they say, but they have policies and procedures just like the US has policies and procedures. Their rules of engagement are the same. We believe in, we trust. And I say, no. The United States would not have caused this kind of harm. And by doing that, by aligning yourself with that harm, you are actually undermining all of the progress that you have made over the past 20 years on human rights and civilian protection. And that seems like a very niche issue, right? Like very narrow, except that this kind of thing, when this happens, sets the stage for what happens in the future. And so the good things that we have relied upon for the past however many years it's been since the Geneva Conventions, I am very worried are slipping away. And that means that these crises that we see are going to be much worse than what we would have otherwise seen. And I am also bringing this up because I think you guys deserve a debate. And I'm looking over at my new friend, John Hudson, who I think takes a different view, and I'm really excited to hear how we can get into this and debate this in this safe space and this wonderful environment that you've created. Thank you.
So no number from Sarah, is that correct?
My number is all over the place. It depends.
Okay, I've asked this question to a lot of people. Yeah, I'll give you a number.
I was immediately gravitating toward a 4, and then Joe said it, and I was like, he's smart, I'm a 4.
Thank you for that opening. We could get into the situation in Israel, Gaza, and that certainly will be a topic today. I think there's a panel specifically on that. There's not specifically on that. Okay. Morgan, your number, please.
I'm going to answer it. First, I will say, disclaimer, I lost my voice yesterday. Very inopportune. I am usually the one sparring loudly and aggressively on these panels, so the good news is that's not going to happen too much today for my co-panelists. So, Charlie, I am going to give you a number. My number is 3, and I'm assuming the audience hasn't seen the way the scale is defined, so just to give you a little context, number 3, which might seem like a cop-out since it's right in the middle, but it's defined as slightly volatile with occasional localized surprises. So I choose 3, but I am going to take issue with the way it's defined, specifically the 2 words localized and surprises. I work on conflict, like my panelists, as a social entrepreneur. I've also been a diplomat. That wasn't in my intro, but I've worked in government, and I've founded and run an NGO. So I've worked across the public sector, the private sector, and civil society, most frequently working on conflict and instability. And what I've seen, whether it was dealing with seemingly localized land conflict over land use rights or natural resources, or very globalized conflict over, over who gets to set global norms or arms control or other issues I work on now. What strikes me about all of those conflicts and all of those things that sound apocalyptic is that they're actually not surprises at all. They're remarkably predictable, and people who study these things through, whether you're a conflict theorist or a policy analyst or an intelligence analyst, you can see these things coming years, sometimes decades out. There are entire ecosystems for, there's like underground betting networks where you can actually bet sort of dark on like what country will have a war next and precisely when, and people who who participate in these gambles, their accuracy rates are incredibly high because these things follow patterns. And so I'll offer to you, if you're wondering what one of those patterns is, and it's a framework that we use a lot in my organization. It comes from conflict theory, and it's the idea that all conflict, whether it's conflict with your spouse over what you're going to have for dinner, or conflict between countries or non-state actors, they all have 5 simple ingredients, and that's key actors with a motive and a strategy, mobilizing means during a window of opportunity. In other words, it's the who, the why, the how, the what, or with what, and the when. Much like a crime series, would say, or the game of Clue, it's Colonel Mustard with the candlestick in the conservatory. You can actually overlay those 5 ingredients, and you can see it coming. So I don't think, while there are a lot of sort of increasing threats, I agree with Joe, that the number of them have proliferated, and the intensity of those threats, whether it's conflict, whether it's human rights violations or nuclear proliferation or climate change or the erosion of trust in institutions, those have all intensified and they've diversified, but so too, to be hopeful, so less than 4 on the scale, so too have you seen a proliferation of the levers that can be used to predict and mitigate these threats? And by that I mean, some folks sort of don't like this idea, but the reality is governments are losing their relative and their absolute power and authority, and government levers are no longer adequate. They're often not even the correct tools to prevent these solutions. Increasingly, civil society, business, people, to use a word that Sarah used, people rallying around an idea, whether it's in digital, in the ecosphere of social media, or on the streets, like you see in any kind of protest movement, whether it's the Arab Spring or the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong, or people rallying around the very intimate experiences of others, like you're seeing in the border countries of Ukraine. This incredible mobilization of very personal, household level will to take in displaced persons, to catalyze support. A conflict that hits very closely to me, Afghanistan, where I served as a diplomat, and our incredible failing as a U.S. government to abide by our commitment to helping our allies, whether those were official Afghans working for the U.S. government or our allies, or others who sort of bolstered and were aligned with our conquest there. We promised them a way to find a pathway to safety, and then we reneged on that commitment in a very egregious and very, very real way. And it wasn't governments who made that right. It was voluntary organizations, whether of veterans, it was civilians who'd never even served in Afghanistan, mobilizing on WhatsApp groups to say, I feel appalled by the fact that these people who believe in ideals that I believe in are now facing death threats, are now being killed in quite real ways. I want to do something to help get them to safety. So I personally relied, even though I was a diplomat, and I had channels to the U.S. government to make good on their commitments to get Afghans I served with out of the country. It wasn't them who made it happen. It was volunteers. It was very local civil society groups. It was WhatsApp groups who helped get some of my former colleagues to safety. I'm proud to say the 12 Afghans I served with, they're now all out of Afghanistan with their families. But I want to emphasize there are still thousands that remain and face imminent threat. So I'm hopeful that the power of civil society, the power of people, is stronger than it's ever been, precisely because what Sarah said, our eyes are on these threats more than ever, thanks to the internet, thanks to the way the information flows, so people can react. That means you, people in this room, can react, can intervene, can use your power as a consumer, can use your power as someone on Facebook or Instagram to speak about issues, can use your power of voting to really affect these issues. And I know we'll talk more about the details as we continue the panel. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Morgan. And batting cleanup down there, John, your number, please, and why?
So I'll give a number because I'll play the game, 4.5. And I'll add to Joe's threats to civilization, I'll add ourselves, human decisions. A little spin off Franklin's quote, it's a better peace if you keep it. So I honestly believe that. Now, I'll put it in the context, I taught strategy, which is the use of force or the threat of use of force to achieve political goals at West Point, but I am a one-trick pony now where I study urban warfare, and the reason I do is because of the trends of the world. In 2008, we became an urbanized planet. More people were living in urban areas than rural areas. Most of the developed world is 90% urban. But that's not the only reason. We also increased our population on the planet from 1960 till now to all things that came before it. So you went from 3 billion to now 7 billion. We're more interconnected than we've ever been in life. And I think we'll talk about that. The fact that whether it's our economies or our lives are more interconnected. We can watch wars happening, we can watch decisions being made, we can talk about the decisions, and we can influence nations. Because all war, and even the framework of nation states, is about the will of the people. What is civilization? What is identity? All of these things. And it is about power. It always has been about power. It always has been. It always will be. And then lastly, the size of militaries. For many of the decisions that we made, all of the world's militaries are very small. Very small. If you think about World War II even, million men and women armies fighting against million man, million armies, alliance and all that. Nobody has that military, not even Putin himself. But I do think we're living in the greatest era, and I agree, in the 1930s, I'm sure there were people talking about it as well, like we're in a great time of volatility. But this is also the greatest test to the multinational systems in which we created after World War II, and I agree, whether that's the United Nations or other groups, to prevent wars, to prevent what Elon Musk which I actually recently got into a debate on X with, to prevent civilization ending wars, whether that's global nuclear war or just giant wars. And he fears it. But he also puts logic to it. So the enduring nature of war is that it's human and that it's uncertain. And that the decisions we make will determine whether wars continue. And inaction, historically, inaction has shown to lead to more violence than action. So that goes back to it. It's a better peace if you keep it. And I do believe we're in the greatest test of the multinational system, whether that was Putin's invasion of Ukraine, or his invasion of Georgia, or his annexation of Crimea, or Iran's use of proxies to redesign the Middle East and create what we have today with the war, which I look forward to discussing. But I will say is that Elon Musk puts logic to the world because he thinks that way. Like the fact that Ukraine should just give up. There's no logic behind people dying. He should just give up. Ukraine should give up and cede what ground, and hopefully Putin will be happy with what he has. He puts logic, but if you look back at all the predictors of war in the past, whether it's in World War II where 75 million people died to keep the peace, to win the war. On the last question before we start our friendly debate on what would the United States do in Gaza? Would we create so much harm? Because I agree, the Geneva Conventions, the Fourth Geneva Conventions, all of that was meant to never again target civilians trying to convince nations to give up, or militaries, or nothing. We won't do that anymore. We agree as a world, although again, Russia is challenging that agreement, that we won't do that. We won't firebomb Tokyo and kill 180,000 people in a single night and kill 300,000 in just that bombing campaign, more than both dropping of the nuclear weapons, which has never been ruled legal, moral, never been questioned on whether it led to the protection of life or the loss of life. Did the ending of World War II lead to a better peace or a more violent peace? Would the United States have caused more harm in Gaza? Well, historically, there's nothing that says that they would have. And that using a framework of counterterrorism for the last 30 years in which it wasn't an existential threat, there was time on our side, there was reason, there was different alliances, and there's different political environments. There are two battles which I use to give people a better framework of. I can't tell you for sure. I'm almost positive, though, if the United States was invaded by a military who did all the awful things that happened on October 7th, to include launching 4,000 rockets in a matter of hours on our borders, took our citizens back into their territory, and then kept raining down 12,000 rockets, what would the United States do? I can say as a former military guy that I'm almost positive that they would respond in overwhelming military force to achieve its objectives and bring the war to an end as quickly as possible. Because again, inaction leads to more than action. And I could argue, and even in the cases that we see in the world today, by allowing them to continue, you're actually allowing for more civilian harm. Two battles, 1945 Battle of Manila, 4,000 American and British personnel, they called them internees, were sitting in the city that we had left 2 years before. They were being tortured, starved, mutilated. We regained the force. MacArthur said, go to Manila and liberate our citizens, US citizens, 3,000. And he said, you can't have air power. I don't want that city destroyed. I love Manila. I don't want the citizens suffering. You can't have air power. You can't have any unobserved artillery. And there are only 17,000 Japanese Navy. We should be able to do that quickly. They had some tunnels. They had all that stuff. 100,000 civilians died. 100,000 civilians died liberating our people in Manila and liberating the Philippine community from the Japanese. Some will say that was before we're better people. We're a better society. That's before the Geneva Conventions. So after the Fourth Geneva Conventions, 1950, the Battle of Seoul. We went to liberate Seoul. We attacked it in Operation Chromite. You know how many civilians died in that battle? There's no record. 2 million Koreans died in that war. There's no record of how many died in that battle, but there was a lot.
Thank you. We had an interesting question here, and this person suggests the audience takes this poll. And I would just suggest that your number is not based whether you're an optimist or a pessimist. We're just trying to get to the bottom of the truth. So don't think if you're a 5, you're a pessimist, or if you're a 1, you're an optimist. Just think of what you think is happening in the world, because reality is the place to start to get to some solutions. And if we don't start with reality, we can't get to any solutions. So I'm going to do this, as the person suggested. I don't think there's many people here under 40, so we're just going to do one poll. So think about this for a second. 5 is the highest number, with tipping points and a lot of catastrophes coming our way. And 1 is the number where you think the global society will stabilize and it will kind of be business as usual, as it has been since World War II, and that more or less abundant, peaceful time we've all lived in. So I'll take a second to think if you're a 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. I will call out the numbers, and we'll raise your hand, and we'll just get a reading of the room. Did I miss a joke? I missed that one, but laughing is good, especially on apocalypses. Okay, if you are a 1 and you think it's going to be pretty much business as usual moving forward, raise your hand. Okay, we have 1. Okay. 2 is just a little step up there. You think it's going to stabilize, but there will be some disruptions, but will be more stable than less stable as a 2. Raise your hand. Okay, we have a couple of 2s. We have 2, 3, 4.
My
Okay,
6-year-old son raised his hand. That's a good sign.
Okay. If you're a 3, if you're in the middle of the road like Sarah, raise your hands. Okay, we have a good group there. Maybe 20%. How about a 4? A lot of 4s. Okay, 4s taking the day, and how many people are 5? Okay. So just to let you know that you're kind of in line with the World Economic Forum. They asked 1,200 folks to rate their numbers, and 54% of those people were 4 or 5s, and only 20% of the people were 1s or 2s. So I think it was, Sari, did you give the 1 to 5, like everything underlying it, or was that Morgan, the 1 to 5, the who, that was you, right? The who, what, the who, why, how, what. You could say what's driving these conflicts. I may be wrong. I've heard that maybe underlying all these conflicts, to some degree, is natural resources. And a battle for those natural resources, or safety around those natural resources. And some people would say that we are in a period of where there's still plenty of oil and gas, but that's starting to level off, and the complexity of our societies use so much energy that a lot of wars and conflicts are underlined by this fight for resources. Does anybody have anything to say about that underlying our predicament at this moment?
I'll respond to that. Yeah, I mean, I studied environmental biology here at CU, and then my career trajectory went towards international conflict, and that's a very logical journey to me, because precisely of the question Charlie just posed, absolutely natural resource conflict and you know the increasing scarcity, the massive scale destruction, not just with climate change, but with desertification, with loss of biodiversity, with land encroachment, with mass migration and human pressures in places that it didn't used to be. All of those things are very real. But I would say those alone are not enough. They're a necessary but not sufficient propellant of violent conflict. It's the human systems, and to John's point, it's power, and it always has been. It's not the economy, stupid. It's human quest for power. It's not greed, it's power. I believe that very much. And if you are able to moderate and temper and have resilient systems that help regulate quests for power, which are fine by nature, but when they become extreme, megalomaniacal, exploitative, when they take advantage of the pressures that already exist with climate change, et cetera, then you get the perfect conditions for massive violent conflict. So I think, people who say we just have to solve environmental problems, or we just have to solve political problems, you need to see a convergence of those two worlds. You need to see how the quest for power is exploiting the strain on the natural environment. And I want to see more convergence in the policy sphere, in the civil society sphere, and in the business sphere of those two things really coming together.
Anybody else thoughts on natural resources underlying our present moment in conflict?
I agree with Morgan that, yes, all those are underlying stresses, but it does go back to power. Because just as much as Elon worried about the rules of artificial intelligence, this is the greatest test of the global rules-based order that we've had since the last World War. So, yeah, it is about power, and power includes gathering the resources in which you not only need to survive your nation if you think you need the breadbasket of Europe in order to survive as a civilization, or are you pursuing power of conquest and growth so that you can believe you can survive in this power structure. But this is why I do believe in the rules-based system to limit the brutality of humankind in the pursuit of power and the pursuit of resources when you have an abundance of resources, but I want more. And this, the haves and the haves not. It does go back to rules-based power structures.
Anybody else? Joe, you want to? One more question, then we'll get to the audience. Another thing I've been pointed out is that the U.S. has been mostly a quite a while now, being the most powerful and pretty much the only power, the only main power in the world for, people would say maybe since World War II, and that is starting to fall apart, and that the world is now breaking into, they call multi-power, with, of course, China and Russia rising to the forefront. Is that also an underlying issue, do you think, as part of why we're seeing so much disruption in the world order at this point?
Oh, just quickly, absolutely. I mean, the prevailing view in Washington is that we're in an era of great power conflict. And we haven't been in one of those for quite some time, since the end of the Cold War, and where the United States was left as the clearly dominant economic, military, political, I would say cultural force in the world. We've never seen anything like the kind of dominance the United States has had over the world, particularly in the last 30 years. That's now changing. The national security strategy of the United States begins with the phrase, "We are at a global inflection point." So things are changing. It's not a prediction of which way it's going to go, but I agree with that assessment. It's tipping one way or the other. And the driver for that, they say, is great power competition. I'm not sure I agree with that. The kind of environmental and climate risks we face, I think, are actually going to be more determinant of where we are. Part of the reason that I'm pessimistic about the next 10 years is that I think climate change is going to get much, much worse. And that what we're doing to resolve climate change is inadequate to the task, and that is going to exacerbate all the local, regional, continental crises that we face. And so I would disagree with that assessment, but undeniably, you have Russia, China, other secondary autocratic systems challenging the US constructed global international order, and they're challenging it successfully. And the US response to that has been inadequate, and in some ways it's being disrupted by our own allies. I mean, I would think that Israel is doing a great disservice to the global international order right now, and that's one of our closest allies. So let me stop there.
Okay, I think we'll go into the.
Wait.
Oh.
Do you mind if I just?
Okay, yes, please.
Yeah, okay. I want to take that in a slightly different direction, which is the rise of authoritarianism, which I'm sure you have all.
That's our panel tomorrow morning here in this room.
I'm not on it.
Oh, okay.
I get to say my piece now. So the rise in authoritarianism, there are two ways that our government could respond to that. One is in the realpolitik way that it is doing, where it is, I think, trading long-term idealistic interests for short-term interests, and I'll say why in a second. And then the second way is to focus on those things like democracy, human rights, all the American values, that patriotic stuff that we all love. And in the first way, that realpolitik way, that is a Saudi defense pact, which is in the works. It is ignoring human rights in Asia, human rights abuses in Asia, so that we can get on the good side of China. It's same with Modi in India, making sure that we get in there before China gets in there, even though Modi is creating massive human rights abuses and is turning into an authoritarian. So these are the two ways, and I think the way that the US government could be responding in this moment is to focus much more on those democratic values, the human rights. You hear it constantly in the rhetoric. It is not actually being implemented in the policy. And I think in that way, they're actually believing the covers of foreign affairs and foreign policy, which says America is on the decline. It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. They somehow believe that. Whereas in my work all over the world, I see that freedom fighters, revolutionaries, people power movements, I'm not talking about violent people, like human rights defenders all over the world, free media, they still look to the United States as that beacon of hope and to support them. And it seems like the US doesn't believe that it has the power to do that anymore, and that's a shame to me.
Okay, this is a tag-on question to that question. So a student entered this question. Do you think other world powers rising to the level of the US would allow for more or less peace? More or less conflict with checks and balances from other countries, question mark? So is this a blessing in disguise, perhaps, or perhaps not?
You mind? That was good. I was like, that was exactly the question I was hoping was gonna be asked. It was my panel a couple years ago at CWA, and I had a pretty fierce debate about the panel topic was, the world is shifting from a monopolar to a multipolar world, and my response was, so what? But actually, more than so what, I truly believe that is it's overdue, and here's why. A monopolar U.S. hegemonic system might have seemed like it created a great, peaceful, stable existence because it did for us. But it was premised on massive amounts of oppression and injustice and inequality and domination. And some of that was very direct and, at the barrel of a gun or at the threat of the use of force. And some of it was very indirect in our economic systems that exploited labor in the developing world, that exploited natural resources, et cetera. I think it was inevitable that you were going to see that challenged. And as people found their way to convene and use their levers of power, whether it was violence, unfortunately, or the power to choose more authoritarian, strongman leaders to challenge the monopolar world. And I think, the US, not just our government, but the American people do have a couple of choices in how they respond. We can be threatened by that, or we can recognize that it was overdue, and that just because our relative power is being challenged, our absolute power is still pretty darn stable and certain. I don't believe that our way of life and freedoms are being existentially threatened right now. I believe our hegemonic, very sort of unfair and imbalanced domination of the world is being threatened, and I frankly think that's an okay thing. I don't think that the way authoritarian leaders, Russia, China, North Korea, et cetera, are responding is particularly helpful, but it is sort of creating, for maybe the first time in the last 50 years, the idea of a polarized, dichotomy, and then you're seeing reasonable people realize there's a continuum in between, and that they can choose, how to react and how to choose. I work a lot in Africa, and this is a key sort of battleground, if you will, for great power competition, because you are seeing these two sort of binary extremes being put to African governments and African people, the U.S. and Western model versus, sort of the China-Russia model, and thankfully, I'm encouraged to see a lot of Africans, government and people and businesses saying, neither, not one or the other. something in the middle, and something different, and something frankly better than either of those extremes.
Thank you. John, would you like to talk about the changing power structure?
Sure. One, we'd have to acknowledge that it's changing, and that's a debate that people have. What's the time frame you're talking about? Near term, midterm, long term? I think this is the test, but it's not the first test. I mean, Russia was testing, China has tested, Iran is testing. And I don't want to just have the heuristics of the now. I agree that Israel-Hamas war has a lot of implications for the future of everything. One, again, going back to what I believe as a realist, that inaction can lead to more violence. And the fact that this power structure was able to gather great military capability and appeasement never has worked. This is the problem that I have as a realist trying to convince people, is that letting Hitler just take Poland, it's okay. Czechoslovakia, he doesn't have any interest. This is just recolonization, all this stuff. Letting Hamas say they want to destroy you, attack you, that's okay, you can deal with that. Letting Iran build immense power, below the nuclear threshold, although it wants it, immense power through the use of proxies to attack the very system, not to attack any individual, to attack the very system that they don't agree with. And an inaction for over decades has led to the moment we're in now. So now it's the decision by humans of what actions do you want to take, or do you want to just temporarily pause what's going on and believe that there is a better future, right? The better angels than our demons. Is that everybody wants no human suffering, right? But these aren't the only two wars, right? And there are people on the panel who know much better than I, Syrian civil war, atrocities going on in Africa. There's a lot of violence in the world, but which ones have the most implications for who we are as the United States? Which I don't get into identity politics, but I do believe that what we have now is because of the decisions we are making that are very short-term focused. That if you don't maintain this system that we have, of course it leads to much more violence and the tipping points and all this stuff. You can always identify the underlying causes of everything, and I teach this. What were the underlying causes of World War I, World War II, all that stuff, but nobody knows what the real trigger will be. But there are a lot of people back then saying, it's coming.
So John, you're saying that you think the world would be more stable if the United States maintained their dominance, and some other panelists are pointing to that the world would be more stable if the power was shared between countries. Anybody else want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I'm weighing in specifically on that or something tangential, but I think I don't, so on Israel in particular, just because it's a great example, I don't think it's a choice between inaction and action. It's the type of action that you take. So I don't think anyone would say, Hamas committed this egregious atrocity, just let them keep going. Absolutely, don't respond. Yes, respond. But I think the way in which Israel is responding is, to my earlier point, undermining a lot of the things that we believe in and that have made us safe for a long time. I believe it's also undermining Israel's ability to actually exist in the future. So that October 7th may have been an existential threat. I think what Israel is doing to itself right now is an existential threat. And so no, I think that was the end of my point. But it's not. It's like up here where I forget what I'm saying. But it's not between inaction and action. It's the type of action that you take. And I think there are many different ways to do that.
We had a couple questions, and it points to maybe another underlying cause of conflict, and it's about religion. Person says, please comment on the impact of the three Abrahamic religions and the likelihood of persistent violent conflicts, global, environmental, and human exploitation. Any thoughts about this underlying religious wars is what's happening here? And this maybe points a bit towards the Middle East situation.
I don't want to hog the mic. I mean, religion in and of its essence is human rule sets, almost a way of life, a way of living. And it isn't the three Abrahamic religions that's causing the violence in the world. It's a gross interpretation of the religions, not, again, inaction within each religion from adhering to the standards or acting. So whether it's radical Islamic fundamentalists or Christian-based fundamentalists, what did you do within that framework of thinking or sets of rules to prevent it from rising to a level where it threatens territory, it threatens power, all of this stuff. And this goes back again to my position. There's a lot of terrorists in the world. There's a lot of evil people in the world, but they don't have nations or massive military capability to harm anybody. They're trying and they're pursuing. This is, you have a peace if you keep it.
I really agree with that. I think that's a great way of framing it. It's not Judaism that's in battle with a Muslim religion. It is an Israeli vision of Israeli nationalism that is in contention with Palestinian nationalism over territory. That's what's going on there, not a moral conflict that has any greater dimension than that.
So earlier I laid out, the principles of conflict theory, key actors with motive, strategy, means, and a window of time. A lot of times people think that religion plays into those 5 ingredients in the motive, as in like some people, some extremists are motivated to assert their religious ideology or way of life, when actually more often when you unpack and dissect conflict, whether it's violent or not, religion actually more plays into the strategy ingredient. That religion and the rules that it can assert is used as part of a strategy to mobilize fighters or to suppress the spoilers or threats. It's very dangerous to see to condemn religion as bad, in its ideology or in its principle or essence. It's what's bad is exactly what we've said a few times now, is the essence of human quest for power. And when that becomes perverse and distorted, it often harnesses religion as one aspect of a strategy to achieve its ultimate motive, which usually has very little to do with religion itself. Right. I would assert, whether it's certainly Islamist extremism, there are the number of people who would consider themselves part of that camp who are actually like true diehard ideologues is so tiny. It's so tiny. The vast majority of people who have been radicalized, mobilized, recruited, and enablers of violent extremism, whether it's Islamist or Christian or political or far right or nationalist. They're being manipulated, they're being mobilized around a strategy that uses religion as one element of it.
Thank you. Another question, and when I originally mentioned this panel to my cousin, and then she looked at all this distinguished guests, she said, "What, no climate expert up here?" So this question points to another underlying driver of what's going on in the world today, all these polycrises overlapping, and that's the big, as Joe put it, the long term is climate change, the biggest threat. Maybe in 10 years, maybe in 20, maybe in 5. Wars, I think, Syria has been pointed as a war, somewhat of climate. Yemen, the violence going on there, somewhat of a war of climate change. Perhaps many other conflicts that are going on within countries now and between countries has a connection somewhat to natural resource overuse, which is creating climate change, which is creating food insecurity and other types of inability to live a sustainable life. So let's talk a little bit about the connection of climate and our present moment, please.
War over water resources. That's one of the great impacts of climate change right now is drought. we experience it here, but it's experienced much more in Africa and parts of in Asia. For example, one of the great threats to the stability of the Iranian regime is drought in Iran, which is causing tremendous suffering within Iran. Some of the conflicts in the Arab world are over access to water, who gets to control the Jordan River resources, for example. So that's just one quick example of how this phenomenon is affecting us right now, not just in the future.
Yeah, I mean, agree to give a few more examples of that. A lot of my work has happened to work with nomadic communities around the world. I lived in Mongolia working with nomadic reindeer herders and nomadic herders for 10 years of my life. And now I work a lot in the Sahel and mostly in West Africa, where you have a lot of herder-farmer conflict, and it's fueled by drought, right? As nomads, as herders who rely on constant movement to new water sources or to where there's pasture that exists because of enough rain and enough water access. As those areas are, contract spatially, but the number of people expand. Also in the Sahel, you have the highest birth rates in the world. And you have this confluence of conflict drivers. More people, bigger livestock herds to sustain those people, less land to graze that livestock on, and so people moving into settled areas to the periphery of cities, where people are now saying, no, you can't graze your livestock on my land. This is where I'm farming, this is where I'm building, this is where I'm, et cetera, and that often results in violence. Communal violence that can be very seemingly localized, but can be extremely intense as well. And you can draw that line very directly from climate change to drought. Lake Chad was the largest lake in the Sahel in West Africa. And if you look at satellite images, just within the last 5 years, they're shocking. This lake has contracted down to almost a puddle, and it used to be the size of one of the Great Lakes. And so all the people that relied on this freshwater system because of climate change are now displaced and now running into other people who say, I don't want you here, and they have weapons.
So this points to the climate change challenge and trying to mitigate, or if we can't mitigate, at least adapt to that. We have 10 minutes left, so I'm going to ask one student question, and then I'm going to ask you all to end with a personal reflection. The student asks, how do we reestablish trust in our government and other societal institutions? If everybody could weigh in on that, maybe just take a minute and a half or two, and then a minute. Go ahead. How do we reestablish trust in our government and our other societal institutions from your point of view?
Elect better governments. It's one way to do it. One of the great discouragements for me in the current era, I don't know if this is the personal part or not, is I'm just flabbergasted that Donald Trump is as popular as he is. I just don't really understand it. But one of the great sources of optimism that I see is the number of people who are entering the political arena to challenge that view of America. And I maybe like you, I give political contributions to people, and there are many more good people that I want to see elected than I can give money to. And I'm very encouraged, especially by maybe I'm showing my age here, but the people in their 30s and 40s that are rising up to this challenge. And so that's one of the ways you do that is restore trust in government, is to have those better people in government. I also see it happening. I don't make this about Gaza too much, but we're seeing in Washington a reaction to Israel that I've never seen before, with people stepping up to the plate, like my senator, Chris Van Hollen, who's just taken the lead, who's very pro-Israel, but is anti-war, anti-this war, and he makes that distinction. I see people making that distinction. It's an increasing sort of sophistication in the way people are dealing with it, and they feel they have the courage and the political space to be able to take positions that were unthinkable even 10 years ago.
Okay, 7 minutes left. Quickly, any ideas on reestablishing trust?
All praise to Senator Van Hollen. He's been amazing on this. Two things. One, get the money out of elections. You guys know why. And then two, another, I think, root cause, way more civic education. I don't know why we got rid of civic education, but I think then people can make better choices and we'll have more participation, and I think that results in more connection with elected leaders who hopefully haven't been elected because they have a ton of money.
Anybody else real quick?
Yeah, I mean, hear ye to that. My comment too is it's easy to say like, oh, those powerful governments, they're bad, they suck, we don't like them. People only have power because it's given to them. Power is a two-way street. There's a social contract, and you're on the other side if you're not in government. And so, accountability, et cetera. I totally agree, campaign finance reform. But also, I would say, legitimacy in government power comes because people elect people who they think share their values, and we don't talk enough about those values. The fact that Joe said it disturbs him how popular Trump is because people don't want to talk about it anymore. So I would say another prescription that I have is civil discourse. Truly talk to your friends and family members who are on the other extreme. Do it. Don't shy away from it. Talk about politics and religion at the dinner table. There are so many good ways to do it. Inquire. Be a creative, empathetic listener. Find out what people's values at their core are. I think you'd be delighted to find, usually when you peel back the layers, there's a lot of commonality in values that then can actually sway people's minds and think, those are my values, then that's not the government I want.
Thank you, Morgan. John?
Sorry, just one thing on that. Apparently, we're not going to have a presidential debate. What? Yeah. Like, in terms of civil discourse.
John, real quickly, we got a couple minutes left.
Sure. So
Restore trust.
again, my answer to that is stop using the old framework. Trust in what is truth go hand in hand. And we live in a world where more people are connected and making their own decisions on what is truth, what institutions to trust, what people to trust. Stop using the old frameworks, whether it's political frameworks or others, to believe that's the way forward. The world has changed and you have to change with it. The fact that Elon Musk is connecting more of the globe than any other people in the world with low orbit, civilian satellites, internet, everything, either you act or you don't. But the fact that people aren't looking to the old frameworks to trust. They want to make their own decision, which I agree back to civics and critical thinking, but you can't continue to apply the same framework and think it'll lead you to a better peace.
Okay, so we have a couple minutes. This is a personal question. So everybody, 4 and 5 got the most votes, but here on our panel too. I think we're living in challenging times. Maybe people would say scary times, but you go outside and you see beautiful trees blooming at the same time. Living in this time, does anybody want to talk about, just briefly, their personal reflections on how you were living in this time and how are you still living a life of meaning and joy?
I do live a life of meaning and joy. I mean, sometimes that's my grandkids. Sometimes it's going to Cape Cod for a month in July to enjoy it. E.B. White once wrote something about how he has two conflicting impulses in his in retirement age. And one was the drive to continue to try to save the world, and the other was a drive to enjoy it. And I think about that a lot. And I try to split my time between the two.
Okay, anybody else, your personal reflections on living in these times?
Sure. Yesterday, I was at my grandmother's funeral. She was 101 in New Jersey. So she lived under German occupation in France. She came to the United States, to New Jersey, with her U.S. military husband. They had 3 kids. They barely had anything, but they were content, and I learned how to make soup out of nothing. And, and then I think about how we didn't even have email until, I was working at the White House in the year 2000. We barely even had email. And now we're carrying around cell phones and we can connect to, I think this is the most amazing time to be living in. And I actually do have quite a lot of hope because of how much I see the goodness in people trying to combat all of the terrible things. And also, I knit obsessively. And I think that is actually saving me at the moment.
I'll hook you up with my cousin. She's an excessive knitter as well. Okay, Morgan, personal reflections.
Yeah, I mean, I know some people, it's like, especially people in our type of work, they have like an escapist thing. My escape is actually more engagement. Like, I feel hopeful and I feel powerful, and any feelings of hopelessness go away when I actually, like try to engage more and do good. That makes me see the beauty in everything. So much so that like I like to bring, my family into my work. My 6-year-old son and husband are in this room right now. They're in the back. So like it's not like my kids are over here and playtime is this separate thing. I'm like, hey, Fox, his name is Fox, like, let's talk about the world. And it's scary, but it's beautiful. It's amazing. And those things are together, and I like to bring them together.
John?
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm the guy who gets to go travel to crazy places, and I was in Gaza a couple weeks ago, and I've returned home back to my better life. And the way I do it is through a lot of reflection and teaching my children like that we are values-based. There are universal human traits of respect and kindness and not doing unnecessary harm. I really internalize that in what I teach to my children. As much as I talk the talk, I got to walk the walk.
Thank you, and that concludes our session. Please give a round of applause, and we'll see you at the next session. Thanks, everybody.